Thank you very. I suppose go this way. Yeah. Thank you very much for the kind remarks. I will refrain from mentioning names because I'm sure that my pronunciation will be terrible. And I've learned from past experiences that perhaps it's better not to do it. When I was a student at Harvard 50 years ago, there was a saying in Boston that the cabot would speak only to the lodge, and the lodge spoke only to God. Because there was this very close society. The cabot family was, of course, very prominent, and the lodge family was very prominent, and they spoke to each other, and they spoke only to God and to nobody else. So it's the same thing is happening today in the professions. When I opened the American Economic Review, to which in the past I used to contribute, but now they talk about neuroscience and all things which have really almost nothing to do with economics. And economists speak only to economists, and philosophers speak only to philosophers, and social scientists speak to social scientists. And so when I got the invitation from Professor Bojanek to speak at a conference which would be attended by a philosopher, I was really delighted, and this was an incentive to immediately say yes, although I had some complication with the schedule, because I had a book that was just published in Italy last week, and there were some presentations which had been scheduled. And anyway, the combination of speaking to philosophers, among others, and speaking about corruption, which is a topic that has interested me for about 20 years, was a combination attractive enough that definitely I wanted to be involved with it. So thank you again, and thank you very much for the invitation and for being here. The presentation today is a broad one. I want to give really a sense of development in this area, a little bit from economics, but also a little bit from other, areas. And I started, by the way, I should say that until around 1990, I'd never had any interest in the topic of corruption. But then in 1992-93, there was Tangentopoli in Italy, which inevitably was a major event, which got rid of a social class, really a political class, and replaced it with a different one. So I began to be interested in the topic. At the time, the institution where I was, the IMF, had no interest whatsoever, and I'll come back to this point a little bit earlier. But let me start with some background. Most of you probably are familiar with the fact that the term corruption comes from a Latin word for the verb to break. So rompere, is really where the word corruption comes. And it implies that either a rule, a principle, or something similar to a code of conduct is broken. You are breaking a rule, you are breaking a law, you are breaking a code of conduct, and therefore corruption is a deviation from accepted or desirable behavior. When you don't behave according to the norms that society determines, then you are acting in a corrupt way. And this, as I will say a little bit later, this creates some problem, this particular definition. It has been thought to be associated with the public sector. When we think of corruption, we normally associate it with acts within the public sector. But now, if you follow the press, you realize that this is a very limited view of corruption. When you think what is going on in sports, for example, all the corruption in the sport industry, people selling games for money, clearly these are acts of corruption within the private sector. If you think of what happened in the financial market during the financial crisis, where people were passing wrong information, were using insider trading, and And this is clearly corruption in the private sector. Therefore, we should really get away from the view that corruption is limited to the public sector and really begin to pay much, much more attention to the spaces, to the public spaces which exist in the private sector that bring out also acts of corruption. Corruption is not a new phenomenon, but it's one of the oldest professions. I will not mention which is the oldest profession, but clearly corruption is one of the oldest. It's mentioned in the Bible. It's prominently mentioned 2,000 years ago in a very nice book published in India, written by Prime Minister of India. His name was Kautilya. And Kautilya says, it's a very interesting definition. He says corruption is like honey or placed on somebody's tongue, that once you feel the honey, it's very difficult not to take advantage of it, And so what he's saying is that people work for the government, actually, for the Raja in that time. Sometimes they would take advantage of the situation in which they were. It's in Gibbon's description of the fall of the Roman Empire. It plays a very large role in that. It's in Dante's Inferno. Dante plays the corrupt people in the deepest places in hell. And it's in the Constitution of the United States. There are two crimes for which the President of the United States can be impeached, can be thrown out. One is treason, and the other one is corruption. It's clear in this guy. It's also in many literary works and opera, Tosca, Manon Lescaut, and so forth. Attitude vis-à-vis corruption vary considerably from country to country and from time to time. There were times, and there are still today countries when corruption was or is considered an almost natural, inevitable phenomenon. In some, it is now assumed to have negative consequences for economic growth, for equity, and for democracy, for the democratic system, but it still remains prevalent and seems to have increased in recent years. In fact, in the past 2-3 years, there have been so many news that if you go by the number of news reported about corruption, you really get to the conclusion that there is much more corruption today than there was a few years ago. During the 90s, maybe I should go back 1 minute. There are some stories on the time when it was considered normal. There are some paintings from Egypt that when you go to the other life after you die, you have to go with gifts to be better received.
Divine being.
Yeah, and there are some story about the Soviet Empire, where that head of republics, when they go to see Brezhnev, was normal to bring a lot of gifts. If you did not bring gifts, then there was a problem. So clearly, in some society, it was considered normal. There are some descriptions that corruption really began to be seen as a bad thing only during the Roman times, the Roman Empire, when they introduced new laws, which the laws indicate that the judges had to be impartial, otherwise you were acting in a corrupt way. During the 1990s, attitude toward corruption suddenly became more negative. And it's, there's a controversy in the literature why this. Up to 1990, if you look at some of the articles, especially written by economists before 1990s, they seem to indicate that corruption was really a good thing, because it was the oil that removed the inefficiency. The rules were seen as being rigid and having been introduced in the past, and corruption was one way of making you go around those rigidities. So some economists have written papers arguing that was really a good thing, But in the 90s, things started changing suddenly. One explanation is the Washington Consensus. Washington Consensus put the emphasis on efficiency, put the emphasis on competition, and clearly corruption affected both efficiency and corruption. But also some people have argued that maybe the end of the competition between the West and the Soviet Union had something to do with it. You know, up to the time when the Soviet empire fell, you know, you didn't care whether Mobutu, the head of the Congo, was corrupt or not, as long as he was in your field. You know, whether it was the American or the Russian, didn't matter. As long as it was on your side, you close your eyes to acts of corruption. You know? Well, corruption started to be called a menace in that period, a menace to democracy and to the market economy. Suddenly, there was less political tolerance and more attention paid to corruption than in earlier years. Why was this? Well, I gave you at least already a couple hypotheses, but also the role of the US government. When Clinton became president of the United States, immediately they introduced a code of conduct for behavior. And there were particular reasons why they did it. You know, at the time, it turns out that the Germans, a German company that bribed a foreign politician to get a contract, not only was not punished, but could take a tax deduction with the bribe. The bribe could be deducted for tax purposes. The Americans could not do it. So the competition, again, market competition, led the Americans to take a very strong position against this. The World Bank and the IMF started getting involved. You know, I remember I was very much involved at the time in the IMF, and the managing director of the fund was Mr. Michel Camdessus. Camdessus was very worried about corruption, you know, was very worried about corruption in France, in fact. He was aware of things that were going on in France, and he wanted to push the idea that the IMF should pay some attention to it. And there was a big fight which lasted 2-3 years, 3-4 years, essentially between the managing director on one side, with my help, because mine was the only department which showed some sympathy, and everybody else in the fund was saying corruption is none of the business of the fund. We are a macroeconomic institution. We should worry about balance of payment and fiscal deficit, but not about corruption, which is an internal problem of the country. Mainly executive directors from developing countries were worried that the fund would get even more intrusive in the activities of particular countries. Clearly, the people from oil exporting countries were worried. So there was a big fight which went on for a while until slowly the fund changed completely from not being interested in corruption to suspending programs to some country like Cambodia and some others because of major acts of corruption. Also, the other institution got involved. The World Bank started playing a major role. Codes of conduct began to be developed. They were based on what is called arm's length principle. This may sound abstract to some of you, what this means. The idea, essentially, and I'll come back because this is an important principle. The idea is that you should treat, in all your economic dealing, you should treat everybody exactly the same way. It doesn't matter whether it's your brother, your cousin, or the husband of your daughter, or somebody from the same tribe, from the same religion. You know, in economic dealings, you should treat everybody at arm's length. That's the meaning of arm's length. And well, during the 90s, the government of several important countries, Italy, as I already mentioned, but Japan, Brazil, and some others, fell because of corruption. You know, there was some government just were thrown out, and measures of corruption started to become available. Up to that time, there was a lot of talk about corruption, but nobody could say, well, this country A, does it have more corruption than country B? So some measures were developed, and the surveys, well, some also, as I already mentioned, some governments and some international institutions started to react to corruption. I already mentioned the US government because of the competition with Germans, etc. I mentioned the IMF, etc. Surveys indicated that political parties, at the time you begin to have some survey by Gallup polls and by others, that indicate that political parties, parliaments, and some public institutions were the sectors that were more exposed to attempt at corruption. In Italy, as I already mentioned, Tangentopoli brought down the political class that has dominated Italy for decades. By the same process seems to be going on right now in Italy. Maybe the same corruption will throw out the current political class. And there was, at the beginning, there was a lot of controversy on the legal definition of corruption, and this is an aspect which may be of interest to philosophers. No? There was a lot of controversy on what is corruption. Here, immediately you have cultural differences. Cultural differences lead to differences in attitude. There is a conflict between the arm's length principle, the principle which tells you that you treat everybody exactly the same way. When somebody knocks at your door and wants a document, and wants a certification, wants a loan, wants something like this, doesn't matter whether it's your brother, your cousin, etc. You treat everybody exactly the same. But there were more traditional norms of behavior, and this is a difficult, really, issue, something that philosophers need to think much more about. There are some code of conduct which go on thousands of years, which are normal in countries. In some countries, unthinkable that you would treat a stranger in exactly the same way as you would treat your brother. And that's the problem that we have today. This Western definition of corruption, which is linked to the arm's length principle, is doesn't fit certain society. That's why you have a continuation of society. You have tribal affiliation, party affiliation, religious affiliation, which leads to preferences. Nepotism, which is something goes back to the Catholic Church and so forth, lead to preference for some people over other people. And it's very, very difficult for the law to really break this. And it's not quite clear that you should always break it. I remember the first time I was exposed to this dilemma was in a television program. I don't watch television anymore, but 25 years ago I used to watch television. And there was a story about a school of dance in New York. And in this school of dance, a girl that was one of the very best dancers in the school was called by the principal and was told that you are going to be punished because during the exam you helped your cousin. And the girl was taken back. He says, but it's my duty to help my cousin, And that's the problem, where you see the conflict between the principal who wants to apply arm's length principle and the girl.
Another principle.
Yeah, it's exactly, So and this comes to also to the problem of gifts, Gift is a big problem. And this, again, philosophers, I think, should pay much, much more attention. In some of my recent writing, I've argued that in society there is really a market for gifts, with the discount rate and rate exchange, cost of exchange. And I could give you many, many examples. In Korea, I'm told, when somebody is elected to parliament, people come with envelopes full of cash, and they donate this to the person on the expectation that in the future they need some favor for this. So there's a clear exchange, and so this is, I remember one time, again, I don't know whether I'm taking too much time, it's okay.
No,
one time I was in Italy and I was invited by a friend of mine who was a high-level officially one of the waterworks, one of the big waterworks in Italy. He said he was having his birthday and he wanted to invite me to the birthday. I said, fine. So we went to this beautiful hotel by the beach, and there were about 150 people there, And I ended up, and then this friend of mine explained to me that he was in charge of assigning public works. But since he was very honest, he never took bribes. But he had assigned public work to somebody to do some work in the railroads. And this guy had given him a party. So he had invited 150 people, and he did not consider this a bribe. It was just an exchange of favor. So that this is one of the problems, that this exchange of favor. When you go to a lawyer and he does something for you, and you are an architect and you do something for him, and you have this exchange of favor, is that acts of corruption, Of course, you know that, bringing a gift to somebody when a daughter or somebody gets married is normal. But if you bring a very large gift, and we expected that, in the future, the gift will be repaid, maybe assigning a job to. So this is an area which really needs to be investigated. Economists have not done it, and the economists study all markets, but they have not done a good job in this area. And I think probably the help of philosophers would be useful. Well, what about? So a question: Are there genuine exchange of gifts and favors, or markets for favors in some countries? Well, even, we have contract with God. God tells you that if you follow the Ten Commandments, then you buy access to heaven, And so it enters in many things, but of course we don't consider that corruption, no, but where is the limit?
Exchange.
Yeah, that's what about the role of lobbyists? This is again something, a few years ago, I had not even heard the word lobbyists. I would not know what it means. Now in Washington, you drown in lobbyists. You go to a restaurant, you are sure that almost everybody around you, if it is a good restaurant, is a lobbyist. You go to K Street, one of the very expensive avenues in Washington, all the offices are occupied by lobbyists. You have thousands of them. What is their job? Some of these lobbyists were former presidential candidates. Many of them are former senators or former head of the Fed, etc. What is the role of these people? The role of these people is to push some law that is beneficial to you and to do it. So is this corruption? To me it is, but people would argue that maybe it's the democratic process that is working its way. The Supreme Court of the United States even decided that the gift given by corporation to politicians, millions of dollars. You can buy yourself a politician in the U.S. now by giving millions of dollars. This is legal. No. So we have this really major problems now. Well, we have also the distinction between what we would call bureaucratic and political corruption. This is a very important distinction. Bureaucratic corruption is simply corruption which accept the rule as they are. No, you are a little bureaucrat which are in charge of giving the licenses and so. There is a rule, you follow the rule, but sometimes somebody gives you money and you speed up the process, or you give a positive reaction rather than a negative reaction. This is what we call bureaucratic corruption. And this, for a while, much of the literature was related to that kind of corruption. But now it's becoming more and more obvious that we have a political corruption, where you really change the rules. The lobbyist story that I told you is not, it's really directed not at interpreting the rule favorably, but at changing the rule in favor of a particular people. So this is a much more dangerous, because this corrupts really the democratic process of countries. When you can bribe the politician, give them enough money that they take a position rather than another, and they pass law which favor one group rather than another. So this is really a problem. Does corruption, well, corruption exists only in the public sector, we already answered that. What about the common space that exists between public and private sectors? Yeah, this is a growing concern to me. When I was in the Italian government, I went from the fund to the Italian government. I was an undersecretary to Mr. Tremonti, at the time. I went to the Italian government with the view that there was a clear line which separated the public from the private sector. There was a firewall. This was public, this was private. When I got into the government, I found out that the Minister of Finance at the Treasury and Finance where I was, which was a huge ministry, had incorporated 4 previous ministries, had the hands in everything, you know, in appointment of managers, in appointment of people on the board, in making rules. So the separation between the public and the private sector that I had anticipated was simply not there. You know, almost anything that happened in the private sector had to have some input from the private sector. And this is a dangerous area, which has really grown because of the complexity of things. You know, we pushed the government sometimes to play a larger and larger role in the private sector, but we tell them you have to privatize, therefore they do the role that they play is very often in terms of regulation, in terms of appointment of people. In Italy, for example, it's normal for the government to get a golden share, you to get enough shares of a company, to privatize the company, but hold enough shares so that they can appoint people to the board and influence the company in this kind of way. So this is really a growing concern. The code of conduct that was developed by the fund some 10 years ago, so 10 years ago, clearly indicated that one of the areas you want to make sure that there is a clear, sharp division between what is private, where the government should have no business, or almost no business, and what is public, where the private sector should have very little to say. So this distinction is these mixed enterprises that are in theory are private, but in public they are managed by the government, and you know, they always create lots of problems. These are enterprises with significant state control, the golden share. And in Italy, for example, I discovered when I was there that there was a kind of institutionalized corruption, which I would call corruption. They would not. Was that, you know, the government, when you become a minister or undersecretary or high-level bureaucrat, you get a salary. The salary is never astronomical, it's normal salary. But then, if you are there long enough, you begin part of this clique that begin to assign each other's position in the board of a public or semi-public enterprises. And you know, being assigned to the board of a company means going once or twice a year for a half day and getting 50,000 euros. You know, if you can be assigned to many of these things, then you end up. Monti, when he became a prime minister last December, he asked all the high-level people to declare their income. And I was astonished to see people at the same position I had, that had the income up to €1 million, you know. And so this is again another area where you want to keep your eyes open. You know, the salary should be the salary, period. You know. By the way, this is a system which was apparently brought from France. In France, this system is prevalent too. So should the corruption be related only to the breaking of specific rules? What about the violation of principles? This is another very difficult area, and probably an area of great interest to philosophers, because what has happened today, that you know, you develop millions of rules. You know, in the financial market there are lots and lots of rules, but as long as you follow the rules, you're okay. No. But sometimes following the rules, you are breaking principle. You know, tax evasion versus tax avoidance is a classic example. Many lawyers will explore all the codes and to try to find what abuses, things that they can take advantage of, with the clear intention of avoiding taxes. But at the same time, they are following the rules, so that they cannot be punished legally, because as long as you follow the rule, you are not punished. So the question is, should we give more important to principles, and perhaps a little bit less to the rule? But if you do that, who interpret the principle? Because this is the other problem. You must have a Supreme Court or a higher court, which is really incorruptible, and can interpret the principle and say, no. In India, they do that. In India, if the Indian government finds somebody trying to avoid taxes, still following all the rules, but the intention is to avoid taxes. And there is a court to decide that they are violating the principle, the person is punished. So this is again something that is on the borderline between economics and others. Specific example, yeah, well, there are lots of examples of the following the rules and the principle from the financial crisis. Many people in New York or in the city of London, they argue they were following the rules, but clearly they create a mess with the financial crisis. I gave you the example of tax avoidance. Well, corruption in the financial sector, if you look at the Financial Times, it's one of the newspapers that I try to read every day. Sometimes I have the impression that the title should be changed from Financial Times to Corruption Times, because there are so many stories about corruption, almost on a single basis. You have insider trading, people get insider information. You have a trading by politicians. It was discovered in the US that politicians who are in the office of senators and congressmen who are dealing with new rules, they all become rich, because they know in advance what some of the changes that may be forthcoming. So that you have asymmetry of information. That's one of the problems that we have in today's world, that information is available on one side, but not on the other side, and you have to trade. A famous economist got a Nobel Prize for these ideas. And you have the LIBOR scandal now. You find that it's the LIBOR, which is used for, I think, for $350 trillion of contract per year, was manipulated by banks to get the advantage. So you clearly, all these are major acts of corruption. What about the action of regulators? Regulators, again, you put some people in charge of regulating some activity, passing of drugs, for example, mining industry and petroleum industry, and you find that these people are really being bought. And sometimes you have this revolving door, that the regulator normally comes from the activities which are being regulated, the argument that they are the only people who know the details. So you hire the people that from the area you want to regulate, and you bring them as regulators. This again is creating a lot of difficulties. A role of political leaders, the decision on tax administration. If you go to some countries, it's normal for the people in the executive to call the head of the tax administration and say, go light on that person and go heavy on that person. And tax administration should be really a totally independent institution. Once you have the laws, the tax law, then you assign this to some groups to direct this. And a few words about the measuring or quantifying corruption. It's not very easy to say that this country is more corrupted than others. Now, in recent years, some numbers have been generated by Transparency International, by the World Bank, and by some other groups. Very often, what they measure is perception. And perception, of course, can be correct, but it can also be wrong. To give you an example, Chile is a relatively uncorrupt country, relatively. It's the least corrupt country in the Americas, the same level as the United States. But there was one time when the governor of the central bank, apparently the secretary of the governor of the central bank, leaked some information to somebody. And these people took advantage of that information and gained a lot of money. Well, the governor was criticized, although he was not himself involved. But immediately the ranking of Chile went down dramatically because the perception. So perception can be a problem. Transparency International, now you can go into Transparency International and download the measurement for about 160 countries. And you can also see what has happened. If you can start in 1995, which was the first year when this was done, and follow it up to the present, and see the ranking of countries, whether it has changed. Some countries have improved dramatically over the years, some countries have worse, and some countries have improved for a while, then they have worse. But this data, with all their shortcomings, are useful, because they are used by economists to make econometric studies. And you know, when I started using this data, I had lots of doubt about them. But then when I used them, I saw that the results were consistent with my a priori. So you know, as we all do, I begin to believe in them. You know? So that just a few. I want to be very brief now. There's corruption and economic growth. There have been lots of econometric studies which have tried to show a correlation. You know, the more corrupt country grow less than the less corrupt one. But then there's the problem of China. You know? In China, everybody knows that there is a lot of corruption in China, but then China is growing faster than anybody else. So maybe we have to revise our perception, you know, if China continues growing like that. It's true that the Chinese are trying to do something about it, you know. And corruption and per capita income, clearly there is a correlation. You know, the more developed country become, the less corruption there is in general, because they can develop better institutions, or perhaps they legalize the corruption. You know, going back to what I was saying about the U.S., you know, they create rules that remove corruption as a corrupt act and make it look as a democratic act. You know, but you know, some of the countries which have the lowest indication of corruption, like New Zealand, Sweden, and so forth, you know, they have a very high income and very low level of perceived corruption. There's been some discussion, mainly it started by Gary Becker, Nobel Prize in economics, that there was a connection between the size of government and the incidence of corruption. That was not quite clear. I think it probably Becker exaggerated. As I said, some of the countries with the highest, at least the highest public spending, like Sweden or the Nordic countries, have relatively low corruption. So maybe there's not much in that argument. And the level of taxes, clearly, you know, the higher taxes, the more there is a tendency for people to evade taxes. And the one I want to say a few words is the growing role of complexity. You know, I've convinced myself, the more I see it, that one of the causes of corruption is complexity. You know, we expect now government to do too many things. You know, I was in a television program in Italy a few months ago, and I made the point that in the US, for example, you have a tax on property. You know, the government assesses your property, try to match the market value. There are problems there, clearly, but assess the property and put 1% of the property, period. In Italy, you assess the property, you determine whether it's in a large city or small city, you determine whether it's in the center of the city or in the periphery, you determine how many people live in the house, what is the age of the people. By the time you have added all these complications, you have given the scope for complexity and for corruption on the part of it. And so this is, if there's one message that I want to overemphasize today, is that pay a lot of attention to complexity. You cannot, the government, as I, you know, the government cannot make heaven on earth, can only prevent earth from becoming hell, you know. So when you put too many complex things, you are trying to really, you are challenging God into making the earth into heaven, you know. Let me see. Okay. Yeah, there's various sectors are exposed to bureaucratic corruption. You know, the authorization, license, obviously, red tape is a big problem. You know, and this is part of the complexity. The more red tape, the more complexity you have, the more corruption you are going to have. Outsourcing of public activities, you have to be careful when you assign contracts outside. You have to be careful that there are precise rules. regulation, creation and interpretation of regulations. Sometimes the regulations are created specifically to allow corruption on the part of some people. And let me skip that. A basic rule also is that if you have monopoly power, if you assign monopoly power to somebody, and you, at the same time, you give discretion to this person, you have created a tremendous possibility of corruption. Because somebody who has monopoly power in assigning contract, in giving a disability pension, in assigning public housing, and you give also the discretion. The problem is that you cannot remove discretion completely, otherwise you create too much rigidity, and so these are very complex area again. Which way it is going? Yeah, maybe just a couple more minutes and I will start. Public investment has been a problem, because public investment always has to be decided what investment to make in a country. There is an investment budget, some high-level person, minister, and so forth, must decide how to use this budget, must decide the area where the money is to be spent, must decide the size of the project. To build a road is a four-lane road, two-lane road, it's a road which is very thick, so there are all those decisions, and these are land themselves, these are large amount of money. The contractor that gets this investment can make a lot of money, so they always try to bribe. So this is one area where the quantity of the investment and the quality of the investment can go in different directions. And there are lots of evidence on unproductive public investment. The white elephant, the classic white elephant that built cathedrals in the desert and so forth. So this is one area that you want to keep the eyes open, the public investment. And well, maybe I could go on for many other things, but let me just conclude that the area where I want to come back is this question of complexity, because the world is becoming just too complex. People want too many objectives being followed. There was a time when taxes were imposed just to collect revenue for the government. Now you want taxes for the environment, taxes for equity, taxes for producing more children or less children, taxes for helping the poor or the young. You have increased too many objectives in the system, and that is really one area which is bringing a lot of problems. And this complexity is affecting many areas. In a book I wrote last year, called Government versus Market, I make the example of Obama, that now is the president of the same country that George Washington was the president 200 years ago. The country of George Washington was relatively simple. Yeah. Now Obama has to receive the ambassador for 200 countries. I have to make speeches when somebody dies in Afghanistan. I have to run for Congress. I have to make speeches for many things. At the same time, he's supposed to follow all the areas. It's clear that the principal agent problems develop there. And there is a beautiful book that you might want to read. It's called The Confidence Man, which gives you the story of the first 2 years of the Obama administration. There's no person in the world who can satisfy all the requirements which are expected today of a prime minister, of a president, because there are simply too many things to do. And that you fall into the danger of relying on people who may have different objectives or different interests, or maybe less honest than they should be, and that is the problem. Maybe I should stop here. Thank you very much.